The smell of burnt coffee and old paper clung to Vivian Clark's clothes as she finally shut down her computer at nearly 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve. Her fingers ached from typing all day. Her eyes burned from staring at legal documents until the words blurred together into meaningless shapes. Outside the office window, fat snowflakes drifted lazily past the glass, settling on the Manhattan streets below in a way that should have been magical if she wasn't so bone-tired and utterly, devastatingly alone. Sarah asked from the doorway, already wrapped in her expensive wool coat, her engagement ring catching the fluorescent lights. "Why don't you come to my parents' place? They always make too much food. You'd be welcome." Vivian forced a smile, the same smile she had perfected over 19 years. The one that said, "I'm fine, really. Don't worry about me." She said thanks, but I have plans. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Her plans consisted of leftover Chinese takeout, a bottle of cheap wine, and whatever Christmas movie marathon was playing on TV. Same as last year, same as every year since the fire took her parents when she was 8 years old, leaving her and her 5-year-old sister Sophie scared in ways that went far deeper than skin. Sophie, who was lying in a hospital bed right now, waiting for a kidney transplant they couldn't afford. Sophie, who had called that afternoon with a voice so weak it made Vivian's heart crack. The law firm was nearly empty, just a few associates like her who had drawn the short straw. Vivian grabbed her bag, checked her phone, and headed for the elevator. The building was one of those old Manhattan structures full of character, which meant the heating was temperamental and the elevator creaked ominously as it descended. Her phone buzzed. The Uber she had requested was here. Black sedan, license plate ending in 4XJ. She pushed through the lobby doors into the frigid December night, her breath forming clouds in front of her face. The street was quieter than usual. Most people are already home with their families, their trees, their traditions. There, a black sedan idling at the curb. Vivian squinted at the license plate through the falling snow. The numbers were hard to make out, but it seemed to end in a J. Close enough. The driver hadn't gotten out to open the door. Fine by her. She could open her own door. She slid into the back seat, grateful for the warmth, and immediately started talking. It was what she did when she was nervous, or sad, or both. Dr. Morrison called it a coping mechanism. She called it unable to shut up. "God, thank you for being on time," she said, dumping her bag beside her and pulling the door shut. "I know it's Christmas Eve and you probably want to be home with your family, but I really appreciate it. Most drivers cancel on me this late. I live in Brooklyn, by the way. Williamsburg. The address should be in the app." The driver said nothing. Not unusual. Some drivers were chatty, some weren't. This one apparently fell into the latter category. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, and Vivian leaned her head back against the leather seat. Really nice leather, actually. Soft and expensive smelling. Maybe Uber had upgraded their standards. "You know what the worst part about Christmas is," she continued, her mouth running ahead of her brain like it always did. "It's not even being alone. I mean, that's bad. Don't get me wrong. But it's that everyone assumes you have somewhere to be. Like it's impossible that someone might not have family or traditions or any of that." She watched the snow falling outside, the city lights blurring into golden streaks. "My parents died 19 years ago. House fire. I was 8. My sister Sophie was 5. We went through the foster system. Got separated more times than I can count. Now Sophie's in the hospital needing a kidney transplant, and I can't even afford my rent, let alone save her life." Her voice cracked, but she kept talking because stopping meant feeling and feeling meant breaking. "People say it gets easier. I don't think it does. I think you just get better at pretending it doesn't hurt." The driver still hadn't said anything, and finally Vivian looked up at the rearview mirror, trying to catch his eye to see if she was annoying him with her rambling, but what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The eyes looking back at her weren't the tired, patient eyes of an Uber driver trying to make it through a holiday shift. They were dark as midnight, intense as a predator, and decidedly not looking at the road. They were looking directly at her through the mirror, and there was something in that gaze that made every nerve in her body suddenly alert. "You're not my Uber driver," she said, the words coming out smaller than she intended. "No," a deep voice replied, rich with an accent she couldn't quite place, but that sent shivers down her spine for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. "I'm not—" Her hand flew to the door handle, but the car was moving too fast now, weaving through traffic with practiced ease. Panic clawed at her throat, every true crime podcast she had ever listened to flooding her mind at once. "Please let me out. I'm sorry. I got in the wrong car. Just let me out and I'll get another ride. Vivian Clark, he said, and hearing her name in his mouth made her blood run cold. Criminal defense attorney at Morrison and Associates. Graduated top of your class from Columbia Law. She lives alone in a basement apartment in Williamsburg because she can't afford anything better. No family except a dying sister. Works 90 hours a week and still can't pay her bills. Her heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. How do you know all that? Who are you? The car slowed slightly, and for the first time, he glanced back at her over his shoulder. The face that went with those intense eyes was almost unfairly handsome. Sharp jawline dusted with stubble, a faint scar on his left cheek, strong nose, full lips that quirked up at one corner in something that wasn't quite a smile. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with dark hair swept back from his face and olive skin that suggested Mediterranean heritage. He was dressed in a suit that probably cost more than 6 months of her rent. My name is Marcus Valencia, he said, and something about the way he said it suggested she should recognize it. When she didn't react with anything but confusion, his smile widened slightly. You really don't know who I am? Should I? Her voice came out steadier than she felt, some lawyer instinct kicking in that told her to stay calm, assess the situation, find the angle. Most people in this city do. He turned back to the road, but she could still feel the weight of his attention on her. But I suppose that's refreshing. You got in my car, started telling me your life story, and you have absolutely no idea that you're sitting in the back seat of one of the most dangerous men in New York? The confession should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, strangely, something in her relaxed slightly. Dangerous men who wanted to hurt you didn't usually announce it so matter-of-factly. They didn't drive luxury sedans with heated leather seats and some kind of expensive cologne that was making it hard to think straight. If you're so dangerous, she heard herself say, why are you telling me that? Isn't that kind of counterproductive to whatever you're planning to do to me? His laugh was low and genuine, filling the car. I'm not planning to do anything to you, Vivian. Though I am reconsidering my evening plans. What does that mean? He was quiet for a moment, navigating a turn with the kind of confidence that suggested he knew exactly where he was going. It means I was on my way home when you got in my car. It means I should have corrected you immediately, told you this wasn't your Uber, but then you started talking. Really talking. And He trailed off, seeming to search for words. I don't often meet people who are genuine, who says exactly what they're thinking without calculating the angle. I have a condition, she blurted out. Verbal diarrhea. I can't stop talking when I'm nervous, and right now, I'm very, very nervous, because I'm in a car with a man who just called himself one of the most dangerous men in New York, and I have no idea where he's taking me. If you want to know where this satisfying story goes, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who loves a good story, and stay tuned, because what's satisfying next might just change everything you think you know about danger and love. Marcus let out a soft laugh, the low sound resonating inside the enclosed space of the car, and Vivian realized it was the first time she had ever heard it. Not cold, not threatening, but almost amused. He said she was interesting. Verbal diarrhea. I like what you call it. Then he fell silent for a moment, as if weighing something before continuing. I'm on my way home for Christmas dinner with my family. My mother cooks enough food to feed an entire army, and you were planning to go back to a basement apartment to eat cold Chinese takeout alone. Vivian stiffened, unsure how to react to that statement. It was not a question, but not quite a comment either, more like an invitation disguised as observation. She said she did not understand what he meant, even though deep down she understood perfectly well. Marcus glanced at her through the rearview mirror, those deep black eyes seeming to read every thought in her mind, and said, I am inviting you to dinner, Vivian Clark, a real Christmas dinner with family, hot food, and people who genuinely want you there. Vivian shook her head immediately, the reflex to refuse deeply ingrained after years of handling everything on her own, and said no, thank you, but no, I cannot have dinner with. She hesitated, searching for the word, with the Mafia. Marcus did not look offended. He merely tilted his head slightly as if she had said something mildly amusing, and replied, Tonight I am not Mafia. Tonight I am just a man inviting a lonely woman to Christmas dinner. My mother would kill me if she knew I let a young woman go home alone tonight. She is very strict about things like that. Vivian kept shaking her head, saying she did not know him, did not know his family, and could not show up at a stranger's house on Christmas Eve as if it were normal. Marcus was quiet for a moment, the car gliding smoothly through snow-covered Manhattan streets. Then he spoke again, his voice gentler, but still heavy enough to demand attention. Do you have another option? Going back to a basement apartment where you are 3 months behind on rent, eating leftovers from yesterday, drinking alone, watching Christmas movies on television while pretending you are fine, that is your plan, isn't it? Vivian did not answer, because she could not. He had described everything with painful accuracy. She hated that he knew so much about her, hated how easily he could see through her, but she hated even more that he was right. He continued, his voice softening slightly. I am not going to hurt you. If I wanted to, I already would have. You have been in my car for 15 minutes, and the worst thing that has happened is having to listen to me talk. I do not think that is the behavior of a serial killer. Vivian almost laughed despite herself. Something in the way he spoke, direct and unguarded, made it hard to dislike him, even though she knew she should be afraid. She asked why he would invite a complete stranger home to have dinner with his family. It made no sense. Marcus did not answer right away. He turned onto another road and Vivian realized they were leaving Manhattan, heading toward Long Island, territory she knew belonged to the wealthiest families in New York. Finally he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. Because you are the first person in a very long time who has spoken to me as if I were a normal man, without fear, without flattery, without calculation. You just talked. And he paused as if searching for the right word. I had forgotten what that felt like. Vivian did not know what to say. She sat quietly in the back seat, watching snowflakes drift past the window, watching the houses grow larger and more extravagant as they moved deeper into Long Island. She knew she should be afraid, should panic, should look for a way out. But something in Marcus's voice, in the way he looked at her through the mirror, made her feel, strangely, safer than she had felt in many years. The car stopped before a massive iron gate, security cameras turning toward them, and Vivian realized she was crossing into the territory of one of the most powerful families in New York, with no way back, only the unknown waiting ahead. The iron gate slowly swung open, as if the car had been recognized, and Vivian held her breath as they glided along a winding stone driveway flanked by rows of trees heavy with fresh snow, Christmas lights blinking on every branch, and creating a scene like the ones she had only ever seen on television. The mansion rose before her like a miniature palace, 3 stories tall with wide, soaring windows spilling warm light into the night, a festive wreath hanging on the massive oak front door, and a Christmas tree at least 4 meters high standing proudly on the front porch, so lavishly decorated that Vivian had to blink several times just to be sure she was not dreaming. She whispered, her voice trembling despite herself, "Is this your house?" And Marcus replied briefly as he shut off the engine, "This is my mother's house. I only stay here on special occasions." He stepped out of the car and walked around to open the door for her, a courteous gesture Vivian had not expected from a man who had just described himself as the most dangerous man in New York, and when she stepped outside the cold Christmas night cut into her skin, yet she barely felt it, still too overwhelmed by everything around her. 2 large men in black suits nodded to Marcus as they passed, their eyes sweeping over Vivian with curiosity but without questions, and she understood they were guards, the kind who protected this house 24 hours a day. Marcus placed a hand lightly against her back, gentle but firm enough to guide her toward the front door, and Vivian felt the warmth of his palm seep through her thin coat. The door opened before they could knock, and a woman appeared in the doorway, her silver hair neatly pinned up, her sharp black eyes identical to her son's, yet her face radiated a warmth Vivian felt instantly. She exclaimed, "Marcus, you're home. Why so late? I've been waiting." Then stopped short when she saw Vivian beside him, her eyes widening in surprise before lighting up, as if she had just received the most wonderful Christmas gift. She stepped forward without waiting for an introduction, and wrapped Vivian in a tight, warm embrace, so sudden and heartfelt that Vivian froze for a moment, unable to remember the last time anyone had held her like that. The woman said tenderly, "Oh, you poor thing. You're so thin, so cold. Come in right now. Why aren't you wearing something warmer? Marcus, how could you let this girl stand out in the cold like this?" Vivian tried to speak, saying, I'm not. But the woman had already pulled her inside before she could finish a single sentence. The warmth of the house enveloped her like an embrace. The rich scent of food drifted from somewhere within. Voices and laughter echoed from deeper inside, and Vivian felt her eyes sting for reasons she could not explain. Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of helplessness she had never heard before, "Mom, this is Vivian. She is." But his mother cut him off. I know. You don't need to explain. What matters now is that this girl needs to eat something immediately. Just look at her, as if she hasn't eaten all week." She tugged Vivian toward the kitchen, and Vivian glanced back at Marcus with a silent plea for help, but he only shrugged and smiled. The first real smile she had seen on his face, no longer cold or enigmatic, but warm and almost gentle. Rosa, for that was her name as Vivian would soon learn, guided her into a chair at the kitchen table and set a steaming plate of food in front of her, homemade lasagna, garlic bread, salad, and said, "Eat, my dear, eat. Don't be shy. In this house no one is allowed to go hungry." Vivian looked down at the food, then up at the woman who watched her with an expression she had only ever seen in old photographs of her own mother, the look of a mother. And for the first time in a very long while, someone was looking at her as if she mattered, as if she deserved to be cared for. Vivian had barely finished her first bite of lasagna when a wave of noise drifted in from the dining room, and Rosa pulled her to her feet, saying, "Eat later. My dear, now you must meet the whole family. They will be so happy to see you." Vivian wanted to protest, wanted to say she was just a stranger, that she did not belong at a family Christmas dinner, but the woman was already leading her forward before she could open her mouth. The dining room was larger than Vivian's basement apartment, with a long oak table that could seat at least 15 people, crystal chandeliers glittering overhead, and another Christmas tree standing in the corner, decorated with ornaments that Vivian could tell were family heirlooms. Yet what caught her attention was not the luxury, but the people seated around the table, all of them turning to look at her with different expressions as she entered. Marcus was already seated at the head of the table, and he stood when he saw her, saying, "This is Vivian Clark. She is my guest tonight." A man a few years younger than Marcus, with similar features but sharper eyes, looked Vivian up and down with undisguised suspicion, and asked a guest, "On Christmas night, you brought a stranger home on Christmas night?" Marcus replied calmly, "Dante, this is not the time." And Vivian understood that the man named Dante was Marcus's brother. Before the tension could thicken, a young woman stood up, long black hair shining and a warm smile on her lips, walked around the table and took Vivian's hand, saying, "Do not mind Dante. He is suspicious of everyone, including his own reflection. I am Isabella, Marcus's sister. It is so nice to meet you." The man beside the seat Isabella had just left nodded politely, appearing quieter and more reserved than the others, and Isabella added, "This is Adrian, my husband." Before Vivian could respond, a small whirlwind rushed toward her, a boy of about 8 with dark curly hair and wide sparkling eyes, shouting, "Uncle Marcus brought a girlfriend home. Uncle Marcus has a girlfriend." The table erupted in noise. Rosa laughed. Isabella covered her mouth. Dante frowned, and Marcus said, "Matteo, she is a guest, not a girlfriend." The boy named Matteo looked at Vivian with unfiltered curiosity and asked if she was a lawyer, saying he had heard Uncle Marcus on the phone, that he said she was a lawyer, that he wanted to be a lawyer when he grew up, and could she teach him? Vivian could not stop herself from smiling, her first genuine smile since stepping into this house, and she said, "Of course, if you want to," and Matteo cheered and pulled her toward the table, insisting she sit beside him. Dinner began, and Vivian had never experienced anything like it in her life. Everyone talking at once, arguing over who cooked which dish best, teasing each other about old stories, Rosa constantly adding food to Vivian's plate even after she said she was full, Matteo asking her hundreds of questions about lawyers and courtrooms and whether she had ever caught bad people. Dante continued to watch her with suspicion but said nothing more, while Marcus remained quiet at the head of the table, observing, and every so often his gaze met hers and there was something in those deep black eyes that made her heart race. Isabella told her about the charitable work she was doing. Adrian asked her about Columbia Law School, and Rosa never stopped asking whether she had eaten enough, whether she was cold, whether she needed anything else. Vivian felt as though she were sinking into a world completely foreign, yet painfully familiar. This was what she had lost 19 years ago. This was what she had longed for all these years without daring to admit it: a family, a noisy dinner, meaningless laughter and arguments, the warmth of people who cared about one another. And then, without warning, tears spilled over, unstoppable, and she sat there at the table of a family of strangers and cried like a child. The table fell silent. Matteo took her hand anxiously and asked if she was all right, if she was hurt. Rosa stood and came to her, wrapping her arms around Vivian from behind and murmuring in a soothing, motherly voice that it was all right, that she should cry, that she was safe here and no one was judging her. Vivian wanted to apologize, wanted to explain, but all she could manage were broken sobs, and in the arms of that unfamiliar woman, she allowed herself to be weak for the first time in many years, until suddenly her phone vibrated in her pocket, and when she looked at the screen through tear-blurred eyes, her heart seemed to stop as she saw the words staring back at her. The hospital number. Vivian hastily wiped her tears and lifted the phone, her heart pounding violently in her chest as she said, "Yes, I'm listening." And Dr. Chen's voice came through on the other end of the line, low and grave in a way Vivian had heard far too many times over the years. "Miss Clark, I'm calling regarding Sophie's condition. This afternoon's test results show that her kidney function has deteriorated far more severely than we anticipated." Vivian rose from the dining table, her legs trembling as she stepped out of the room, asking, "What do you mean by severe? Can you explain it to me clearly?" And Dr. Chen was silent for a second before continuing, "Sophie needs a kidney transplant within 3 months. Otherwise," he stopped, and Vivian understood the rest of the sentence without him saying it. "Otherwise her sister would die." Her voice shaking, Vivian asked how much it would cost, even though she already knew the answer, even though she had searched it hundreds of times online during sleepless nights, and when Dr. Chen named a figure close to $500,000, she felt as though someone had punched her in the stomach. She said, "I understand. Thank you for calling," then ended the call and stood there in the opulent hallway of the mansion, staring into nothingness with empty eyes. $500,000. She did not have $500,000. She did not even have $5,000. She was 3 months behind on rent and eating instant noodles for breakfast to save money for Sophie's hospital bills. She had done everything she could, worked 90 hours a week, sold everything of value, borrowed from anyone willing to lend to her, and it still was not enough. It would never be enough. Her knees buckled and she nearly collapsed if not for a pair of strong arms catching her from behind. Marcus had followed her into the hallway at some point and steadied her, his voice low and worried as he asked what happened. Vivian could not speak. She only shook her head as tears spilled again, and Marcus guided her into a smaller room at the end of the hall, a study with a soft sofa and gentle lighting, helping her sit down and sitting beside her, saying nothing, simply waiting. At last Vivian spoke, her voice broken and choking, telling him about Sophie, about her sister, the only family she had left, about the fire 19 years ago when she was 8 and Sophie was 5, about how she had tried to shield her sister from the flames but Sophie had still been badly burned, about the years in foster care when they were separated, found each other again, then separated once more, about the kidney disease Sophie developed at 16 as a complication from those old burns, about how Vivian had spent her entire life trying to save the only person she had left. She said Sophie needed a transplant within 3 months and I don't have the money. I have no way out. I've done everything. I've tried my hardest. But $500,000. I can't. I don't know what to do. Her voice shattered and she cried, no longer holding herself together, no longer pretending to be strong, crying like the 8-year-old girl watching her home disappear into flames, powerless to save her parents. Marcus said nothing. He simply stayed beside her, one hand resting against her back, letting her cry, letting her release all the pain she had buried for so many years. And when she had cried herself empty, when the sobs faded and only hollowness remained, Marcus finally spoke, his voice no longer cold like it had been in the car, no longer distant like when he spoke of being the most dangerous man in New York, but steady and gentle as he said, "I will help you." Vivian lifted her gaze to Marcus, her eyes still red and swollen from crying, and asked what he had just said, her voice hoarse as if she did not trust her own hearing, and Marcus met her eyes without hesitation and said, "I will cover the entire cost of Sophie's kidney transplant. Everything. Hospital fees, surgery, medication, post-operative care, everything you need." Vivian recoiled even though she was seated on the sofa, her body reacting to the offer as if it were a threat, shaking her head and saying, "No, no, I cannot accept this. I will not take your money." Marcus asked why not, his tone calm, as if offering nearly $500,000 to a stranger were the most ordinary thing in the world. Vivian stood up, her legs still trembling but needing distance, needing space to think, and said, "Because I do not take money from." She stopped and swallowed hard. "From the Mafia. From someone like you. I do not know how you make your money, and I do not want to know. I cannot owe you this kind of debt." Marcus stood as well, nearly a head taller than her, and when he faced her in the small room his presence was almost overwhelming. Yet his voice remained steady as he said, "This is not Mafia money. This is my money. Money I earn completely legally through real estate and companies I own. I can show you financial statements if you want. Vivian shook her head more forcefully and said, "That is not the point. I do not take money from anyone. I can handle things myself. I always have." Marcus asked again, his voice sharper now. "Can you really handle it? You are living in a damp basement apartment, 3 months behind on rent, working 90 hours a week, and still unable to cover your sister's medical bills. Is that what you call handling it?" Vivian felt as if she had been struck, her voice trembling with anger and shame, as she said, "You have no right to talk to me like that. You know nothing about my life. You do not know how hard I have fought to get here." Marcus stepped closer, his dark eyes holding something she could not read, and said, I know you have fought. I know you are strong. I know you have carried everything alone for 19 years, but this is not about pride. This is your sister's life." Vivian wanted to scream, wanted to tell him that help always came with a price, that she had learned that lesson in foster care, when every kindness had conditions attached. But instead, she asked quietly, exhausted, "Why? Why do you want to help me? You do not know me. We have known each other less than 3 hours. Why do you care?" Marcus was silent for a long moment, long enough for her to think he would not answer. Then he spoke slowly and deeply. "Because you are the first person in a long time who has looked at me like I am a normal man. Because you are not afraid of me even though you know who I am. Because you—" he paused and looked away as if searching for the right word. "Because you make me want to do something good, and I have not felt that in many years." Vivian did not know how to respond to that confession. She stood there in silence, her heart torn between pride and desperation, between fear and hope, and finally she said, her voice shaking but resolute, "If you truly want to help, then this is my condition. I will be your legal counsel, everything legitimate. I will help you with contracts and legal matters, and I will repay the money over time. It may take many years, but I will repay it." Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then a small smile appeared on his lips and he said, "All right. If that is what you need in order to accept it, then all right." Vivian knew he was agreeing only to ease her conscience, knew that with her income she would never truly repay such a sum, but at least she could keep a fragment of her dignity, at least she would not be accepting charity. And Marcus stood and said, his voice returning to the decisiveness she had heard in the car, "Now we are going to the hospital." The hospital on Christmas night was frighteningly quiet, the white corridors echoing only with the sound of their footsteps and the occasional hum of machines from patient rooms, and Vivian had been here so many times she could have found Sophie's room with her eyes closed, yet tonight everything felt different. Perhaps because of the man walking beside her. Marcus had not spoken a word during the drive from Long Island to Manhattan. He had simply driven in silence, and this time let her sit in the front seat instead of the back like a passenger, and somehow that silence comforted her more than any reassurance ever could. When they stopped outside room 412, Vivian paused and turned to Marcus and told him he did not need to come in, that she could see her sister alone, but Marcus only placed a hand on her back and gently guided her toward the door, saying he wanted to meet the person he was about to help. Vivian opened the door and stepped inside. The small hospital room lit by soft overhead lights and tiny strands of Christmas lights a nurse had hung by the window to create a festive feeling, and on the white bed in the center of the room Sophie lay there, her skin so pale it was almost translucent, old burn scars still visible on her arms, yet her eyes brightened the moment she saw her sister. Sophie called out weakly, "Viv, you're here. I thought you had to work late." Then she noticed Marcus standing behind Vivian, and her eyes widened as she asked, in a surprised but teasing voice, who Vivian had brought with her. Vivian hesitated and said, "This is Marcus. He is," then stopped, because she did not know how to introduce him. An acquaintance, a Mafia boss, the man who had just offered to pay nearly $500,000 to save her sister's life. Marcus stepped forward and spoke far more gently than Vivian had ever heard him speak, saying, "I am your sister's friend, Marcus Valencia. It is very nice to meet you, Sophie. Your sister has told me a lot about you." Sophie looked from Marcus to Vivian and back again, a weak but mischievous smile forming on her lips as she said, "A friend. The way he looks at you, that is not how friends look. Viv, do you have a boyfriend now and not tell me?" Vivian blushed and quickly said, "No, he is not my boyfriend. We just met tonight." But Sophie only smiled and said, "Well, maybe you just met. But he is here with you on Christmas night. In a hospital, that says a lot, sis." Marcus neither confirmed nor denied it. He only looked at Sophie with an expression Vivian could not read, then said he would step out to speak with the doctor, and that Vivian should stay with her sister. Before Vivian could object, he was already gone, and Sophie took her sister's hand and pulled her down onto the chair beside the bed, whispering with curiosity who he really was, and telling her not to call him just a friend because she did not believe it. Vivian sighed, unsure how to explain, and told Sophie not to worry, that she would take care of everything like she always did. But Sophie looked at her sadly and said that Vivian always said that, always carried everything alone, and then glanced toward the door where Marcus had disappeared, and said softly that this time someone was helping her, and that she was glad. Vivian felt her throat tighten and could not speak. She only squeezed her sister's hand and sat there in silence, listening to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, listening to Sophie's shallow breathing, praying that this time everything would be all right. 20 minutes later, Marcus returned, his face carefully neutral, yet something in his eyes made Vivian leap to her feet as she asked what the doctor had said, and Marcus looked at her, then at Sophie, then back at her and said calmly, as if discussing the weather, that Sophie would have a kidney within 48 hours. He explained that his team had located a perfect match through a private international donor registry that public hospitals couldn't access, that she would be operated on by the best medical team available, and that Vivian no longer needed to worry about anything. Vivian stood there frozen, mouth open, not knowing whether to cry or scream, or hug him or hit him for making such a decision, without asking her. But before she could do anything, Sophie spoke from the bed, her voice weak, yet filled with emotion, saying she had told Vivian so, that he was definitely not just a friend. They left the hospital close to midnight, and Marcus drove Vivian back to the Valencia estate instead of her basement apartment, telling her she was far too exhausted to be alone tonight, and Vivian did not have the strength to argue. She had lived through too many emotions in a single day, and her body felt as though it might collapse at any moment. Rosa was waiting at the door despite the late hour. She embraced Vivian and led her to a guest bedroom on the second floor, a room larger than Vivian's entire apartment, with a 4-poster bed dressed in crisp white linens, a thick down comforter, and a vase of fresh flowers on the bedside table. Rosa placed a silk set of pajamas on the bed and told her to rest, that they would talk in the morning, then kissed Vivian's forehead the way a mother kisses her daughter before leaving. Vivian stood alone in the unfamiliar room that somehow felt warmer than any place she had ever known, changed into the pajamas, and lay down thinking she would never be able to sleep after everything that had happened. Yet the moment her head touched the pillow, she fell into the deepest sleep she had had in years. Sunlight filtering through the curtains woke her the next morning, and for a few seconds Vivian struggled to remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The night before had not been a dream. She was truly lying in the mansion of a Mafia boss who had promised to save her sister's life. She had barely sat up when the door burst open, and Mateo rushed in like a small tornado, shouting that she was awake and to hurry because Santa Claus had left her a present. Before she could react, the boy grabbed her hand and pulled her out of bed, and she hurriedly wrapped herself in a robe someone had placed on the chair and let Mateo lead her downstairs. The living room was full. Rosa was pouring coffee. Isabella sat beside Adrian on the sofa. Dante stood in the corner still watching her with a guarded expression, and Marcus was standing near the Christmas tree, his eyes finding her the moment she entered, and something warm flickering in his gaze. Mateo tugged her toward the tree and pointed at a small box wrapped in blue paper, telling her it was her present and that Santa had left it there that morning. Vivian stared at the gift in disbelief and said she had nothing to give in return, that she had not prepared anything, feeling embarrassed for arriving empty-handed. Rosa stepped beside her and took her hand, telling her she did not need to give anything, that her presence there was more than enough, and to open the gift. Vivian sat down and carefully peeled away the wrapping paper to reveal a hand-knitted blue wool scarf, soft and warm, and she looked up at Rosa in confusion. Rosa smiled and said she had knitted it the night before while waiting for them to come home, that the color matched Vivian's eyes, and that she thought she would need it because her coat was far too thin. Vivian held the scarf and suddenly could not stop the tears, crying right there in the living room on Christmas morning, crying because it was the first Christmas gift she had received in 19 years, crying because a woman who had been a stranger only hours before had stayed up all night to knit something just for her, crying because she could not remember the last time anyone had cared whether she was warm or not. Mateo rushed to her side in alarm, asking if she was all right, if she did not like the gift, if she was sad, and Vivian shook her head and forced a smile through her tears, telling him no, that she loved it, that she was crying because she was happy, because she was very, very happy. The boy did not fully understand but hugged her anyway. Then Isabella came over and hugged her too, and Rosa wrapped her arms around both of them, and Vivian found herself surrounded by people she had met less than a day ago who were already treating her like family. She looked up and met Marcus's gaze. He stood near the tree, not joining the group embrace, but watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, one that was gentle and almost protective, and for the first time in her life, Vivian felt as though she truly had a family. After the lavish Christmas lunch, with countless dishes, Rosa insisted Vivian eat at least 2 servings of each. Marcus suggested they take a walk in the garden, and Vivian agreed even though she sensed he had something private he wanted to say. The garden behind the mansion stretched wide and open, snow blanketing the dormant rose bushes and the bare rows of trees, afternoon sunlight falling softly over everything, and creating a peaceful scene like the landscape paintings Vivian had only ever seen in museums. They walked side by side in silence for a while, their breath forming small white clouds in the cold air, until Marcus stopped beside a stone bench beneath an ancient oak and pulled a small black velvet box from his coat pocket. Vivian eyed it warily and said she had already told him she could not accept anything more. But Marcus simply opened the box, and inside was not jewelry as she expected, but a silver key attached to a simple keychain. He told her it was the key to the family's secure apartment on the Upper East Side, an address known only to family members, and that she needed a place to stay, because her basement apartment was neither safe nor suitable for her to continue living in. Vivian shook her head immediately and said she could not accept it, that he had already done far too much, and she could not keep taking things from him like this. Marcus stepped closer, close enough for her to catch the scent of his expensive cologne, mixed with the faint smell of pine from the Christmas trees, and he said quietly but firmly that she had no home to return to, that her landlord was reclaiming the apartment because she was behind on rent, and asked where she planned to sleep, on an office couch perhaps. Vivian wanted to argue but could not, because he was right. She did not know how he knew, but the eviction notice had arrived the week before and she had been lost ever since. She asked softly why he knew everything about her, and Marcus replied that he needed to know, because when he cared about someone, he had to make sure they were safe. Vivian looked up at him and saw the intensity in his dark eyes, something she had never seen in anyone before, and somehow the distance between them had closed. She did not know who had stepped closer, perhaps both of them. His breath warmed her cheek in the cold air, his hand rose to her face, his fingers rough yet unexpectedly gentle, and Vivian found herself leaning toward him, as if drawn by an invisible force. Her eyes drifted shut and she could feel the warmth of his lips only millimeters away from hers, when a voice rang out from the back door. "Uncle Marcus, Miss Vivian, Grandma says it's time for dessert." Mateo's voice startled them both, and they sprang apart, like teenagers caught doing something forbidden. Vivian's face burning so hot she was certain it could melt the snow around her, while Marcus let out a heavy sigh and muttered something in Spanish she did not understand, but that sounded very much like a curse. Mateo ran over, grabbed Vivian's hand, and pulled her toward the house, completely unaware of the moment he had just shattered, chattering excitedly about how his grandmother made the best apple pie in the world, and how Vivian absolutely had to try it. Vivian let the boy pull her along, but she glanced back at Marcus one last time, and his gaze was still fixed on her, filled with something burning and patient, as if he were telling her that this was not the time, but there would be a time. They had barely stepped inside when Dante appeared in the hallway, his face tense and grave, stripped of its usual cool detachment, and he said Marcus needed to step outside for a moment because there was a problem. Marcus looked at his brother, and his expression changed instantly. The warm man who had almost kissed her in the garden vanished, replaced by the cold and dangerous Mafia boss she had met the night before, and Dante added 3 words that seemed to freeze the entire room. "Kozlov has made his move." Marcus and Dante disappeared into the study at the end of the hallway, the thick oak door slamming shut behind them, and in a single instant the atmosphere inside the house shifted completely. Rosa ushered Mateo upstairs under the excuse of an afternoon nap. Isabella and Adrian withdrew to their own room, and Vivian was left standing alone in the vast living room, unsure of what she should do, whether she should stay or leave, ask questions or remain silent. She paced for a while, trying to convince herself that this was none of her business, that she was only a guest and had no right to involve herself in the affairs of their family. Yet something kept pulling at her, perhaps the unease she felt after seeing the sudden change in Marcus's expression, perhaps the instinct of a lawyer who needed to understand what was unfolding. Her feet carried her toward the hallway before her mind could stop her, and as she neared the study door she heard voices slipping through the narrow opening. Dante's voice sharp and furious, Marcus's low and controlled but edged with a tension she had never heard before. Dante said that the Kozlovs had attacked a warehouse at the port the night before, that 2 of their men were dead and the shipment was gone, that the attackers knew exactly when and where to strike, and asked if Marcus understood what that meant. Marcus replied that there was a mole, his voice cold as ice, that someone inside their own house was selling information to Viktor Kozlov. Vivian stood frozen in place, knowing she should not be listening yet unable to move, as Dante continued, saying Viktor wanted a war, that he had been waiting for this moment since their father was still alive, that now he believed the time had come, and that if they did not find the traitor. Adrian spoke up then, his voice calmer than the brothers, saying they needed to act quickly, that Viktor was not a man who waited, that if he had struck once he would strike again, and next time it might not be a warehouse, it might be this house, it might be the family. Vivian stepped back without realizing, and knocked over a vase on the console table, the crash echoing down the quiet hallway as the study door flew open and Dante stood there, fury blazing on his face as he demanded to know how much she had heard, his tone accusing, as if she were a criminal. Vivian could not find her voice, standing there amid the shattered porcelain at her feet, feeling like an intruder, an outsider who had learned far too much. Marcus appeared behind Dante and placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, telling him that was enough, and that he would speak with her himself. Then he guided Vivian back toward the living room, leaving Dante standing behind them with suspicion burning in his eyes. When they were far enough away, Marcus stopped and looked at her, asking without anger but with gravity what she had heard. Vivian swallowed and chose honesty, telling him she had heard about the attack, about Kozlov, about the mole inside his house, apologizing and saying she had not meant to eavesdrop, that she had only been worried and wanted to understand what was happening. Marcus exhaled and told her she should not know these things, that they were dangerous for her, that the more she knew, the more she became a target. Vivian met his gaze, knowing he was right yet feeling something inside her refused to retreat, and said that she already knew and that she could help, that she was a lawyer trained to analyze evidence and identify liars, that she had done so in hundreds of courtrooms. Marcus shook his head and said this was not a courtroom, that this was the underworld where people did not play by rules, but Vivian did not back down, saying that in any world a traitor was still a traitor, that they still behaved strangely, still left traces, still contradicted themselves, and that she knew how to find those cracks. Marcus studied her for a long moment, his eyes weighing her, assessing her, and finally he asked, his voice no longer dismissive but tinged with curiosity, whether she understood what she was asking to be involved in. Marcus finally agreed to let Vivian help, but only under one condition that could not be negotiated. She had to have 2 bodyguards with her 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no exceptions and no arguments. Vivian protested immediately, saying she did not need guards, that she had lived alone her entire life and she was fine, that she was not a child who needed protecting. But Marcus looked at her with an expression that left no room for compromise and told her this was not a request. Vivian, this was a condition. Kozlov knew about her. They knew she was with him, and if she wanted to help, then she had to let him keep her safe. They argued for nearly half an hour in the living room, Vivian stubborn and Marcus unyielding. But in the end, she gave in because she knew he was right, because she had heard what Dante said about Viktor Kozlov, about how he spared no one. 2 days later, Vivian went to the hospital to visit Sophie with 2 large men walking a few steps behind her, and she felt strange and uncomfortable, as if she were a president or some kind of celebrity in need of protection. But she tried to ignore them and focus on her sister. Sophie stared at the 2 guards standing outside her hospital room with wide eyes and asked who they were and why they were following Vivian. And Vivian lied, saying they were Marcus's friends who happened to be heading the same way and offered her a ride to the hospital. And Sophie looked unconvinced but did not press further, for which Vivian was grateful. After leaving the hospital, Vivian stopped by a small cafe nearby to buy a hot latte, needing caffeine to stay alert after staying up until 3 a.m. reading through personnel files Marcus had given her. And while the 2 bodyguards stood outside watching through the glass, Vivian sat at a small table in the corner and opened her laptop, only to have a man sit down across from her. She looked up and froze. The man was in his late 20s with platinum blonde hair and eyes as cold as ice, dressed in an expensive black leather jacket with a predatory smile on his lips, and he spoke in a thick Russian accent, asking if she was Vivian Clark, Marcus Valencia's woman, saying he had heard a great deal about her. Vivian felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. She knew exactly who he was without ever having met him, and she forced herself to speak calmly as she asked who he was. The man smiled, a smile that never reached his eyes, and said he was Alexei Kozlov, the son of Viktor Kozlov, and that he had come to send his regards to her lover. Vivian wanted to stand up and leave, but her legs felt nailed to the chair, as Alexei leaned forward and spoke in a low voice, as if sharing a secret, telling her that Marcus had killed his brother 10 years earlier, had taken everything from his family, and now he would take everything from Marcus. At that moment, the two bodyguards rushed into the cafe, having spotted Alexei through the window and recognized who was sitting with her. But Alexei rose calmly as if nothing had happened, looked at Vivian one last time, and told her to give his regards to Marcus, to tell him that he would take everything Marcus loved, one thing at a time, and that she would be the first. Alexei walked out of the cafe and disappeared into the crowd on the street before the guards could react, leaving Vivian sitting there trembling, her hands ice cold and her heart pounding as if it might burst from her chest. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and called Marcus, and he answered immediately as if he had been waiting, and when she told him what had just happened, she heard a terrifying silence on the other end of the line, a silence heavier than any rage. Marcus finally spoke, his voice cold as ice and sharp as a blade, telling her to stay where she was and not move because he was coming. And exactly 10 minutes later he appeared at the cafe door, his eyes finding her instantly, and something in that look made her feel both frightened and safe at the same time. And he came to her, took hold of her shoulders to check if she was hurt, then said in a low voice filled with lethal intent that they had touched her and they would pay for it. That night Vivian could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alexei Kozlov's icy blue gaze and heard his threatening voice echoing in her mind. "You will be the first," and she lay on the soft bed in the guest room of the Valencia estate, staring up at the ceiling in the darkness, feeling as though the wall of strength she had built over 19 years was finally beginning to crack. Eventually, she got up and slipped a robe over her shoulders, needing air, needing space, needing to escape the four walls that felt as if they were closing in on her. And she stepped out onto the balcony, the winter cold biting into her skin, but she did not care, standing there watching snow drift softly through the glow of the garden lights as she tried to calm the frantic rhythm of her heart. She did not hear footsteps, but she sensed his presence before he spoke. Marcus said quietly from behind her that she should be sleeping, and Vivian did not turn around. She said she could not sleep, that every time she closed her eyes she saw him again and heard what he had said, and she hated it, hated being afraid. Marcus stepped closer until his shoulder was nearly touching hers. He said nothing, simply stood there in silence as if his presence alone might be enough to chase away her fear, and they remained like that for a long while watching the snow fall, until Vivian finally spoke in a small, weary voice and asked him to tell her about himself, about why he had become the man he was, saying she had told him everything about her life, yet knew nothing about his. Marcus was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer. Then he began to speak, his voice low and distant, as if he were talking about another man in another lifetime, telling her about his father, about how Viktor Kozlov had murdered him when Marcus was 18, right in front of his eyes, and how he had been powerless to stop it, about being forced to take control while he was still too young, becoming the head of the family before he had even been allowed to grieve. He told her about the first time he killed someone. When he was 19, a hitman Kozlov had sent to kill his mother, how Marcus had shot him in the living room of this very house, and how his hands had never truly stopped shaking after that night. "I am not a good man, Vivian," Marcus said hoarsely. "I have done unforgivable things. I have spilled blood, and I will spill more to protect my family. You should not be close to someone like me." Vivian turned to look at him, at the hardened face hiding so much pain, at the dark eyes carrying so much weight, and she said that he had saved her sister's life, given her a place to stay, cared about her when no one else had, and that he was not as bad as he believed himself to be. Marcus looked back at her, and in the dim light of the falling snow, his face softened as he said she was too kind to him and that he did not deserve it, and Vivian lifted her hand to his cheek, feeling the rough stubble and the faint scar along his left cheek, telling him to let her decide who was worthy of her. Then the distance between them disappeared. She did not know who leaned in first, but their lips met, gentle at first like a question and then deeper when the answer was yes, a kiss, tasting of snow and tears and unspoken promises, Marcus's arm wrapping around her waist to pull her closer, as Vivian felt herself sinking into something she had been searching for her entire life without realizing it. And when they finally parted, Marcus rested his forehead against hers and whispered that he could not promise to keep her safe, but he would die before letting anyone hurt her. 2 days after the kiss on the balcony, Sophie's surgery day arrived, and Vivian woke at 5 a.m. with the sensation of a heavy stone pressing against her chest, and Marcus was already waiting downstairs when she came down the stairs, saying nothing, simply handing her a cup of hot coffee and taking her hand, his presence alone being everything she needed in that moment. They reached the hospital before the sky had fully brightened, and Vivian was surprised to see that it was not just the two of them. Rosa was already waiting in the lobby with a large bag full of food, saying Sophie would need strength when she woke up, and so would Vivian, that she had to eat, to be strong enough to wait. Isabella and Adrian arrived shortly after, Isabella carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers, and Adrian bringing a soft pillow, because he said hospital chairs were uncomfortable for long waits. But what moved Vivian the most was when Matteo ran into the lobby holding a hand-drawn card, giving it to her and saying he had drawn it for Sophie, that he had drawn her healthy and smiling because he believed she would be all right. Vivian looked at the card with its crooked drawing of a brown-haired girl surrounded by hearts, her eyes burning as she thanked Matteo and everyone else and tried to say they did not have to do all this, only for Rosa to interrupt her immediately and say Sophie was her sister, which meant she was family, and family always stood together. Sophie was taken into surgery at 7 in the morning, and Vivian managed to hold her sister's hand one last time before the operating room doors closed, telling her she would be fine and that she would be right there and not going anywhere. And then began the longest wait of her life. 8 hours that felt like 8 years. Vivian pacing the hallway until Marcus gently forced her to sit, refusing to let her skip eating when Rosa pressed a sandwich into her hands with the unyielding look of a mother who would not accept no. Every time a nurse walked by, Vivian sprang to her feet. Every time an elevator chimed, she turned her head, and Marcus stayed beside her the entire time, not speaking much but always present, his hand holding hers or resting against her back like an anchor, keeping her from being swept away by fear. At the 4th hour, Isabella brought coffee for everyone. At the 6th hour, Matteo fell asleep against Adrian's shoulder. At the 7th hour, Dante appeared and sat beside Marcus without a word, a silent gesture of support Vivian had not expected from the man who still watched her with suspicion. And then at the 8th hour, Dr. Chen stepped out of the operating room, his face tired but carrying a faint smile as he said the surgery had been successful, that Sophie was recovering well, that her body was accepting the new kidney, that she would be all right. Vivian did not know when her knees gave way. She only knew Marcus caught her before she hit the floor, and she cried, crying as she never had before, crying with relief, with gratitude, with the release of 19 years of weight slipping from her shoulders. She clung to Marcus and cried into his shoulder, not caring that the entire Valencia family was watching, not caring that Dante was standing right there, needing only to be held in that moment, and Marcus held her tightly, one hand stroking her hair, as he whispered in her ear that she saw now. He had told her her sister would be fine, that he would always be there. The Valencia family applauded around them. Rosa cried and murmured thanks to God. Matteo jumped up and down asking if Sophie was better now and whether he could go see her. And for the first time in her life, Vivian allowed herself to believe that everything truly would be all right. 2 days after the surgery, Sophie was recovering far better than anyone had expected, and Dr. Chen said she would likely be discharged within a few more days, and Vivian felt as though a massive weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders, allowing her at last to focus on the promise she had made to Marcus. She began the search for the mole in a methodical, disciplined way, and Marcus gave her complete access to the personnel files of everyone working at the estate and across the family's businesses, more than 50 people in total, including guards, housekeepers, drivers, cooks, and those closest to the inner circle. Vivian spent hours reading every file, noting work schedules, family backgrounds, financial histories, and anything even slightly out of place, using skills she had sharpened over years in courtrooms to analyze patterns and identify inconsistencies. She proposed a different approach to Marcus. Instead of direct interrogations as Dante preferred, she would speak to each person casually, asking about work, family, daily routines, and observe their reactions. Marcus agreed, and arranged the meetings under the pretense that Vivian was the family's new legal advisor and needed to understand how the estate functioned. Vivian interviewed everyone one by one, starting with the security team, then the house staff, the cooks, the drivers, asking simple questions while watching every gesture, every glance, every hesitation, no matter how small. Most people were relaxed and transparent, many having worked for the Valencia family for more than 10 years, their loyalty evident in the way they spoke about Rosa, about Marcus, about the house itself. But one man caught Vivian's attention, Jerome, the 45-year-old head butler who had served the family for nearly 20 years, polite and professional in every answer, yet something about him felt wrong in a way she could not immediately define. She asked about his daily duties, and Jerome responded smoothly. She asked about his family, and he said he had a wife and 2 children in Puerto Rico, his voice trembling slightly when he mentioned them, and his eyes flicking to the side for a brief instant before returning to hers. She asked about the night the warehouse was attacked, and Jerome said he had been in the mansion all night as usual. But when she asked what exactly he had been doing at 11 that night, he hesitated a fraction of a second too long before answering that he had been checking the locks. Vivian noted it and dismissed him, but her legal instincts were already sounding an alarm. Over the following days, she observed Jerome more closely without letting him notice. Seeing that he often took private phone calls and stepped outside into the garden to speak, that he disappeared at odd hours and returned visibly tense, and once she saw him hurriedly slip a second phone into his pocket when he noticed her passing by. She went to Marcus in his study and told him she was not 100% certain, but she believed Jerome was a problem, that his behavior was irregular and his account of that night inconsistent. Marcus looked at her in disbelief and said Jerome had worked for his family for 20 years and was practically family, but Vivian met his gaze steadily and said that sometimes the closest people were the ones least suspected, that she needed more time to be sure, but he should be careful about what he said in Jerome's presence. That night, lying in bed, Vivian replayed everything she had observed and came to the decision that she needed concrete proof, that she had to be certain before accusing a man who had served the Valencia family for nearly half his life, and to do that she would have to search on her own, a decision that could very well cost her her life. Near midnight that night, Vivian woke to the sound of footsteps moving down the hallway, and when she peered through the narrow crack of her door, she saw Jerome slipping outside with a phone pressed to his ear, and she knew this was her only chance. She waited until his shadow disappeared before leaving her room, her heart pounding violently as she moved through the darkened corridors toward Jerome's quarters in the lower wing of the estate, reserved for staff. The door was unlocked, and she slipped inside, switching on the flashlight of her phone and beginning to search, her hands shaking as she went through drawers, the closet, under the pillow, anywhere evidence might be hidden. She found it in the bottom drawer of the bedside table, a cheap burner phone that a highly paid head butler like Jerome had no reason to own, and when she turned it on, her blood ran cold at the sight of Russian messages, photos of the Valencia family warehouse maps, Marcus's movement schedules, and detailed information about the mansion's security system. This was proof, clear and undeniable, and just as Vivian turned to leave the door behind her flew open, Jerome stood there, his face darkening as he saw the phone in her hand, his voice low and threatening as he said she should not be there. "Miss Clark." Vivian backed up until her spine hit the wall, forcing her voice to stay steady even as her heart felt ready to burst, telling him she knew what he was doing, that she had proof, and that he should surrender before things became worse. Jerome stepped closer, a kitchen knife in his hand taken from somewhere unseen, and said he did not want to do this, that she was a good person, but she knew too much, and if they found out he had been discovered, they would kill his family. Vivian asked in a trembling voice who they were. "Kozlov." And Jerome nodded, his eyes red and glassy, as if on the verge of tears, saying they had taken his wife and children in Puerto Rico, that they had sent him videos, that they said if he did not cooperate they would, and he could not finish the sentence, but Vivian understood. Jerome moved closer, the knife shaking in his grip, and Vivian closed her eyes, bracing herself for the worst when the door burst open a second time, and Marcus charged in with Dante right behind him. Everything happened in seconds. Dante lunged and slammed Jerome to the floor, the knife skidding away, and Marcus stood there staring at the man who had served his family for 20 years, lying on the ground with an expression impossible to read. Marcus asked, in a voice cold as ice, why. Why Jerome had betrayed them after being with the family since Marcus was a child. Jerome broke down, tears streaming over his lined face, as he said he had no choice, that Kozlov had taken his family, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, that they had threatened to send him pieces of them if he did not comply, that he knew what he had done was wrong, but that it was his family and he could not let them die. The room fell silent, and Vivian looked at Jerome with pity despite knowing how much damage he had caused, because she understood what it meant to do anything to protect family, having done the same for Sophie. Dante wanted to kill Jerome immediately, calling him a traitor responsible for the deaths of their men. But Marcus raised a hand to stop him and turned to Vivian as if searching for an answer, and she knew this was the moment she had to speak, the moment she had to offer a solution other than death, the moment the lawyer in her had to step forward. Vivian said, "Do not kill him, use him." And both Marcus and Dante stared at her as if she had just said something insane. But she explained quickly that Jerome could be a witness, that he knew how Kozlov operated, knew who contacted him, knew what they were planning, and more importantly, that she knew someone who could help them use this information legally. And when Marcus asked who that was, Vivian took a deep breath before answering, Detective Raymond Shaw from the FBI. a man who had been tracking Kozlov for years without enough evidence to act. She admitted she had reached out to him anonymously to propose a hypothetical deal, keeping the Valencia name out of it until Marcus gave the word. The room seemed to freeze. Dante looked at her with a fury that suggested he might kill her on the spot, while Marcus fell into a terrifying silence, his eyes darkening and his jaw tightening so hard she could see the tendons standing out in his neck. And when he finally spoke, his voice was so cold she barely recognized it as his, as he asked if she had contacted the FBI without telling him, if she had brought the federal government into his family's affairs without his consent. Vivian did not step back even though every instinct told her to, and she said she had contacted someone who could keep his family safe legally, someone who could destroy Kozlov without forcing Marcus to spill more blood, that she had done this for him, for his family, because she did not want to see him kill anyone else. Marcus moved closer, towering over her, his presence overwhelming at such close distance, and asked if she understood that she was playing with fire, if she understood what would happen to his family if the FBI decided to turn on them. And Vivian met his gaze without blinking, and she said she understood, which was why she had drafted a conditional immunity agreement first. She assured him that nothing was signed, and no evidence was shared yet, but Shaw wanted Kozlov so badly he was willing to make a deal. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then turned to Dante and ordered Jerome detained, said they would meet this FBI agent, and added, looking back at Vivian with an expression that held anger and something else she could not read, that if the agent played dirty, she would be held responsible. The meeting took place 2 days later at a neutral restaurant in Manhattan. Detective Shaw was a man in his 40s, with salt and pepper hair and the sharp eyes of someone who had spent too long in investigations, and he sat across from Marcus and Dante with caution but no fear. The tension so thick Vivian could feel it as Marcus and Shaw studied each other like predators, neither trusting the other and neither willing to yield first. Vivian sat between them and spoke, saying that both men wanted the same thing, Kozlov gone, that Shaw wanted him arrested because it was his job, and Marcus wanted him gone because he threatened his family, so why not work together? Shaw spoke slowly and said that Valencia would provide evidence and a witness, Jerome, allowing the FBI to build an airtight case against Kozlov, and in return they would not interfere with the Valencia family's business operations. Marcus asked about Jerome's family in Puerto Rico, and Shaw replied that they would be protected and placed into witness protection, that Kozlov would never reach them. Dante objected and said he did not trust the FBI, but Marcus raised a hand to silence him, studied Shaw for a long moment, then looked at Vivian, and in his eyes something softened if only briefly. Marcus asked when, and Shaw answered New Year's Eve, explaining that Kozlov was hosting a large party at his estate, where all the key figures of his organization would be present, making it the best opportunity to take them all at once. Marcus was silent for a moment, then nodded and said they would cooperate, but if anything happened to his family, and he looked at Shaw with the gaze of a Mafia boss rather than a businessman, Shaw would wish he had never heard the name Valencia. Shaw nodded, and they shook hands, a pact forged between the law and the underworld, and Vivian finally exhaled for the first time in days, and as Shaw stood to leave, he said they would move on New Year's Eve and asked if they were ready. On the night of December 29th, 2 days before everything was set to unfold, Marcus took Vivian to his private penthouse on the Upper East Side, a place he told her he had never brought anyone to before her, perched on the top floor of a luxury building overlooking all of Manhattan, with floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the city below glittering like an endless sea of lights, leaving Vivian standing there speechless, as Marcus disappeared into the kitchen and said that tonight he would cook for her, that his mother had taught him when he was young, and this was the first time he had ever cooked for anyone outside his family, prompting Vivian to smile and ask whether she should be worried or honored, to which Marcus replied both. She sat on a bar stool in the kitchen and watched him cook. Watched hands that had once done brutal things now gently slicing vegetables and stirring sauce, watched a face usually carved from ice focus intently on the smallest details, and realized this Marcus was entirely different from the man she had met in the sedan on Christmas night. Dinner was homemade pasta with slow simmered tomato and beef sauce, red wine from his private collection, candles lit on the table while snow drifted softly beyond the glass, everything so perfect that Vivian felt as though she were inside a dream she feared waking from. They talked about everything and nothing, about her childhood in foster care, about the years he had been forced to carry his family on his shoulders while still too young, about dreams they had both abandoned, and hopes they were both afraid to admit, until Vivian finally asked what he wanted after all of this was over. Marcus was silent for a moment, then set his glass down and looked at her with dark eyes that had never truly left her all evening. and said that he wanted her, that he wanted to wake up every morning and see her beside him, that he wanted to listen to her talk endlessly about things no one else cared about but that fascinated him, that he wanted a life with her, a life he had never believed he deserved. Vivian felt tears rise in her eyes as she told him he knew she did not belong to his world, that she was just an ordinary lawyer with debt and a sick sister and nothing to offer him. But Marcus stood, walked around the table, knelt in front of her and took her hands, telling her that she gave him what no one else ever had: honesty, that she looked at him as a man and not a mafia boss, that she belonged with him and the world would have to adapt. He pulled her to her feet, one arm around her waist and the other lifting her chin as he whispered if she was sure, and Vivian answered by closing the distance between them, her lips meeting his with every emotion she had held back for days, the kiss beginning gently, before deepening, as his hand threaded into her hair and drew her closer. Warmth blooming through her, until it felt as though she were burning from the inside out. He lifted her and carried her toward the bedroom, and that night they gave each other everything they had, not only their bodies but trust, hope, and an unspoken promise of a future they both longed for. Vivian woke the next morning in Marcus's arms, her head resting on his chest as she listened to the steady rhythm of his heart, morning light filtering through the curtains as she realized it was the first time in a very long while she had woken without feeling alone. And Marcus whispered into her hair that in 2 more days, after everything was finished, he would give her a new life, one she deserved. To which Vivian lifted her head, looked at him, and said she did not need a new life. She only needed him. On the night of December 31st, the Valencia estate glowed with lights and laughter, Rosa having decorated the house more lavishly than ever with strands of warm golden lights, silver and gold balloons, and a new Christmas tree standing in the living room to replace the old one that had begun to wilt. And from the outside it looked like nothing more than a cozy family gathering to welcome the new year. Yet Vivian could feel the tension running beneath every smile and every well-wish, because she knew this night was not only New Year's Eve but a night that would decide many fates. Marcus stood beside her in a perfectly tailored black suit, but his eyes kept flicking to his phone and sweeping the room as if searching for danger. He had stationed extra guards around the estate and slipped a small gun into her hand that morning, telling her it was only for protection and that she would not need to use it. Vivian tried to immerse herself in the party, chatting with Isabella about New Year plans, helping Rosa arrange the food on the table, and laughing when Mateo tugged her into a corner with a conspiratorial expression. The boy handed her a sheet of paper folded into quarters and said solemnly that it was his legal brief and that he had worked very hard on it and she should read it. Vivian unfolded the paper and found the crooked handwriting of an 8-year-old, the title reading Legal Brief on Why Vivian Should Marry Uncle Marcus, followed by a list of reasons including that Uncle Marcus smiled more when she was around, that she made great cakes even though he had never eaten them, but believed they were good, and that she would be the best aunt in the world. Vivian laughed until tears streamed down her face and hugged Mateo, telling him it was the best legal brief she had ever read, and the boy beamed and ran off to tell Isabella that Vivian loved his gift. At that moment Marcus's phone vibrated and he stepped into the hallway to answer it, and Vivian watched him go with a growing sense of unease. A few minutes later Marcus returned, his face more tense than before, and he spoke quietly with Dante and Adrian before the 3 of them began moving toward the door, Vivian following and asking what was happening. Marcus told her Shaw had just called, that they were executing the raid on Kozlov's party, and everything was proceeding according to plan, that they needed to be on standby to assist remotely, and that she was to stay here with his mother and Isabella and not go anywhere. He kissed her forehead and said he would be back before midnight, he promised, then disappeared through the door with Dante and Adrian. Vivian stood there watching the door close, the unease in her chest tightening, but she forced it down and returned to the party, not wanting Rosa or Isabella to worry. 15 minutes passed, then 30. Vivian paced the living room and checked her phone again and again, even though she knew Marcus would not call while he was working. Mateo tried to pull her into a board game, but she could not focus, her thoughts circling Marcus, Kozlov, and all the things that could go wrong. Then her phone vibrated, not Marcus, but a message from an unknown number, and when she opened it, her blood turned to ice at the words on the screen. Send my regards to Marcus, and tell him I am on my way to see his family. She was just about to call Marcus when the power in the mansion suddenly cut out, darkness swallowing everything as Rosa's scream echoed from somewhere in the house, followed by the sickening thud of silenced gunshots taking down the guards outside, the sound of shattering glass, and running footsteps. At the same moment, Marcus's phone rang and the horrifying truth crashed into place as Shaw's urgent voice came through on speaker. Alexei is not at the party. Repeat. Alexei Kozlov is not here. He knows the plan. He is heading to the Valencia estate now. Everything happened too fast, Rosa screamed, and dragged Mateo toward the safe room in the basement. Isabella ran after them, but Vivian could not follow because the front door was kicked in, and Alexei Kozlov stepped inside with 2 gunmen, their weapons aimed straight at her, and he smiled when he saw her standing alone in the darkened living room, moonlight streaming through shattered windows and casting ghostly streaks across his face. "Your guards were disappointingly easy to silence," he sneered, stepping over the broken glass. "Vivian Clark, at last we meet again. I told you, you would be the first." Vivian backed away step by step, her fingers brushing the small gun Marcus had given her, hidden at her waist. But she knew she could never fire faster than 3 guns already trained on her. Alexei moved closer, and said she was Marcus Valencia's weakness, the only thing he cared about outside his family, and that he would take her, make Marcus watch her die, then kill every member of Marcus's family one by one, until Marcus begged him to stop. Vivian knew she had to buy time, had to keep him talking long enough for Marcus to get back, and she used the skills she had honed in hundreds of courtrooms, asking in a voice calmer than she felt why he hated Marcus so much, what had happened between their families. Alexei stopped, the icy blue of his eyes flashing with something dark as he said Marcus Valencia had killed his brother, taken away the only person who had ever cared for him, and that his father had used him as nothing more than a weapon for revenge, that he had grown up in the shadow of his brother's death and would not rest until Marcus lost everything the way he had. Vivian kept him talking, stretching out the conversation while secretly sending her location to Shaw through her phone without looking at the screen, asking about his plan, how he had learned about the FBI operation, who had betrayed the information, and Alexei boasted as if he wanted someone to know how clever he was, saying Jerome was not the only one he had inside the Valencia house, that he had eyes and ears everywhere. Then tires screeched outside, and the door was kicked open again. Marcus stormed in with a gun in his hand and Dante right behind him, Marcus's eyes finding Vivian instantly, and for the first time she saw real fear in those dark eyes. Everything exploded into motion. Gunshots rang out. More glass shattered. Vivian dropped to the floor on instinct and drew the gun Marcus had given her. Not firing but ready, Dante's shots took down Alexei's gunmen, and Marcus faced Alexei directly, 2 men bound by a blood feud staring at each other with death in their eyes. Alexei fired first and missed. Marcus did not, the bullet tearing through Alexei's shoulder and sending him crashing to the floor with a scream. Marcus kicked the gun from his hand and aimed at his head, and Vivian saw Marcus's finger tighten on the trigger as she screamed for him to stop, to let the FBI handle it, reminding him that he had promised her not to spill more blood. Marcus stood there, shaking with rage and adrenaline, then looked at her, into her pleading eyes, and slowly lowered the gun. At that moment the FBI stormed in, Shaw leading the tactical team, cuffing Alexei and reading him his rights as he screamed that this was not over. Vivian rose on trembling legs, and Marcus was at her side instantly, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, as he whispered that he thought he had lost her, that he thought he had arrived too late, and Vivian clung to him and told him he had not been too late, that he had made it in time, that he always did. Then the clock in the living room began to chime, 12 clear bells announcing the arrival of the new year, the FBI securing the scene around them, Alexei being dragged away in handcuffs, and Marcus looking only at her, ignoring the chaos, seeing her as if she were the only thing left in the universe. Marcus never took his eyes off her even as Shaw was barking orders to the FBI team to secure the scene, even as Dante was checking to make sure Rosa and Mateo were safe, even as police sirens wailed outside the shattered doors. He looked at Vivian as if she were the center of the universe, and then he did something no one expected, right there in the ruined living room, with broken glass scattered across the floor and Alexei's blood still dark and wet. Marcus dropped to his knees in front of Vivian and said in a voice trembling not with fear but with feeling that he had no ring, no prepared speech, nothing but a heart beating for her, that she had climbed into the wrong car on Christmas night and completely changed his life, that she had shown him he could be a better man, that she had saved his family with her intelligence and courage, and that he could not imagine a single future day without her by his side, and he asked her to marry him. Vivian looked down at the most powerful man in New York, kneeling before a poor lawyer who owned nothing but a once broken heart, now stitched back together. She laughed through her tears and asked if this was really how he was proposing, surrounded by FBI agents and criminals in handcuffs, and Marcus laughed and said he did not want to wait another second, that he had almost lost her that night, and realized life was too short to wait for the perfect moment. Vivian pulled him to his feet and said yes, Yes, 1,000 times yes, then kissed him right there in the middle of the chaos, as Shaw shook his head with a grin and said he had seen many things in his career, but a proposal at a crime scene was a first. Rosa and Mateo rushed out from the safe room when they heard it was over, and when Rosa saw Marcus holding Vivian, she cried and said her son had finally found the woman he deserved, while Mateo jumped up and down shouting that his legal brief had worked and that he had told everyone Vivian would say yes, and the room burst into laughter even though only minutes earlier it had been filled with gunfire and terror. 6 months later, Vivian stood before a mirror in a pristine white wedding dress, Sophie behind her with a radiant smile on a face now healthy and glowing, her sister fully recovered from the transplant and the most beautiful bridesmaid Vivian could imagine, and the wedding took place in the small church where the Valencia family had once attended Christmas Mass, Rosa crying through the entire ceremony and whispering thanks to God for bringing this girl into their family. Mateo was the ring bearer, clutching his original legal brief like an official legal document of the marriage, and Dante stood to speak, saying he had once thought Vivian was a spy and doubted everything about her, but now he knew she was the angel who had held his brother together, drawing laughter and applause from the entire church. And when Marcus and Vivian shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the Valencia family cheered so loudly the priest had to remind them they were still inside a church. Both father and son Kozlov were serving decades-long prison sentences, their criminal empire completely dismantled, and Marcus had begun transitioning all of the family's businesses into fully legitimate ventures. Vivian opened a small law firm dedicated to helping people who could not afford legal representation, just as she had dreamed since her days in foster care, and Marcus supported her every step of the way. On their wedding night, they stood on the penthouse balcony overlooking the glittering lights of Manhattan, and Marcus asked if she regretted getting into the wrong car that night, and Vivian laughed and said not for a second that it had been the best decision of her life, even if she had not known it at the time. And Marcus kissed her hair and said there had been no mistake at all, only fate placing the right people in the right place at the right time. 1 year earlier, Vivian Clark had been a lonely, exhausted lawyer living in a damp basement apartment, carrying the unbearable responsibility of saving her sister's life with no idea how, and now she had a husband who loved her without condition, a sister who was healthy and happy, and a large family where the table was always full and love never ran out. And it had all begun with a Christmas night, a wrong car, and a man once called the most dangerous in New York, who turned out to be the safest and most beautiful thing to ever enter her life. This story reminds us that what looks like a catastrophic mistake can sometimes be the doorway to something miraculous, that we should never judge a person solely by appearances or reputation, that love can arrive from the most unexpected places and change our lives in ways we never imagined, and that family is not only those bound by blood but those who choose to love and protect us, that resilience and courage can carry us through the darkest circumstances, and that it is never too late to find happiness no matter how much pain you have endured. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel, liking and sharing this video so more people can hear stories like this every day, and let us know in the comments how the journey of Vivian and Marcus made you feel, whether it reminded you of something in your own life, and whether you believe in destined love and chance encounters that change everything, because we read every comment and treasure every voice. We wish all of you watching good health, a life filled with joy and meaning, and the strength to always find light, even in the darkest moments. Just as Vivian found Marcus on that lonely Christmas night, goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video with even more moving and meaningful stories.